ia mai aurora I manungonga. E ngonga I wala I matarangi aru te kohu e kohu tahi penua. Haere rata na te mutunga mai o tarangi huki mai rata na kia kita mai koe ta pito pito tō tāua whane. Whakaronga mai ka wanakai!
Wairau Valley, Marlborough, June 1843. It's here that a pivotal and bloody event from our past unfolds. The precursor to civil war, to vast land confiscations and the utter devastation of the indigenous Māori people. Colonial history framed it as a massacre and a fray. But the truth of what really happened and why is so much more than that. I'm Mihingarangi Forbes. Join me for the stories of Wairau. Just 10 k's north of Blenheim, on State Highway 1, is what's officially known as Tuamarina, which in itself speaks volumes because Tuamarina is a corruption of the Māori Tua Marino, meaning the calm beyond. Yet there's nothing calm about this story. Here in Wairau, still waters run deep. This ancient titoke tree is nearly 190 years old. And this tree is the last living witness to the events of Wairau, the greed and the slaughter.
There were a party of about 120 Ngāti Toa, including men, women and children, so it wasn't a fortified settlement or anything like that. It was a people camping beside the stream here.
Kaore a Ngāti Toa I haere atu ki te Wairau ki te whawhai, I haere ki te kōrero. Nā wairā ka tupu te raruraru, a ka take te pū ka mate arongo. And that's an expression of fear, that Ngāti Toa never went down to the Wairau to fight. In fact, they went down there to kōrero. And when they got there, the situation escalated.
Here, on this exact spot, on the morning of June 17, 1843, relations between Pākehā and Māori explode. The issue is land. The New Zealand company, the land speculating business run by the Wakefield family, wants to acquire more of it for a flood of newly arriving British settlers, and Ngāti Toa, the land owners, who refuse to sell. The colonial narrative of what follows lays the blame squarely on Māori.
It's described as a bloodthirsty, savage, barbaric massacre of law-abiding settlers.
The story begins here in Whakatū, Nelson. You have to work really hard to imagine what things might have been like in the 1840s. Basic at best. New arrivals from an old world looking for a fresh start, but it was way harder than they'd been led to believe. Food was scarce, land was too. Quite simply, they'd been overpromised and underdelivered.
The settlers arrive from February 1842 onwards. They've purchased their lands in good faith from the New Zealand company. They start clamouring to have access to those lands, where are the lands that they bought from the company.
There's this idea that it was a happy little settlement. It wasn't. And instead of finding this wonderful place that they can start a new life that was different to the life they faced in England, they faced hardship, in some cases close to starvation, and almost a dream that hadn't even come close to coming true.
I mean, first of all, you know, the Wakefields were a bunch of fraudsters. They had sold land which they didn't own in London or in England, and then all these people came out and looking for their land, and they didn't have the land.
We've got roads and streets all over the country dedicated to the Wakefield brothers who masterminded the colonisation of New Zealand. There was Captain Arthur Wakefield, who'd die at Wairau, his brother, Colonel William Wakefield, who pulled the strings as principal of the New Zealand Company in Wellington, and the most famous of the lot, Edward Gibbon Wakefield, back in England, trying to rebuild his reputation after a checkered past.
So the New Zealand Company is a really critical part of the story. It's founded in 1839. This is really colonisation by a private company. They have a monopoly right to acquire large areas of land for Māori and sell it to settlers. Edward Gibbon Wakefield is a key figure in this, and he is imprisoned for abducting a 15-year-old heiress, Ellen Turner, along with his brother William Wakefield. They're sentenced to prison for 3 years. During his time in jail, he develops this idea about what he calls systematic colonisation. He's very influential in terms of securing support and funding for the New Zealand Company. So William Wakefield was the New Zealand Company's principal agent in Wellington and a key figure in terms of the company's relationship, both with the settlers here and also with the company representatives in London. Arthur Wakefield is another brother of Edward. He serves in the Royal Navy. He leaves at the end of 1841, where he feels his progress in the Navy has come to a halt, really, and he takes on the position of the company's agent in Nelson after selecting the site for that settlement. And so he has responsibility for managing the company's affairs in Nelson. And in that role, he is really one of the prime targets for the settler agitation demanding access to the lands that they had purchased from the company. So he's sort of in the gun in terms of the need to find the lands that settlers had been promised. So William Wakefield is dispatched on the Tory soon after the company is founded, and he enters into a number of deals, one with Te Raupaha, Ngāti Toa and others, a Kapiti, another in Wellington and another in Queen Charlotte Sound. And these land deals purport to sell to the New Zealand Company all of the lands between Moko and northern Taranaki down to the Huranui River in North Canterbury, an area estimated at 20 million acres, so nearly a third of the entire country that Wakefield has supposedly purchased from a handful of rangatira who represent a tiny fraction of those with customary interests in those lands. In return, Ngāti Toa receive guns, ammunition, various tools and utensils.
The New Zealand Company regarded the treaty as an annoying encumbrance at best and something to be ignored. They were selling land, for example, in the Hutt Valley that they didn't own, got here and hurriedly came up with deals with Ngāti Toa, with Te Aotearoa and other Wellington iwi that supposedly gained them the right to settle. They did the same with Whakatū, and that is still murky. It seems to have been done reasonably seamlessly, and certainly with the agreement of Te Raupaha, who had mana whenua over parts of Whakatū at the time. The Whakatū iwi didn't share that view, and they've always felt that some of the land that was sold from underneath them was sold by someone without the ability to do so.
Eight iwi lay claim to Whakatū, Nelson, 3 to Wairau, but it is Ngāti Toa and their fearsome leader Te Rauparaha who are preeminent. He led Te Heke, the migration to and the conquest of these lands in the 1820s after bloody intertribal fighting. For him, this is Ngāti Toa land, and it's not for sale.
Well, there's lots of kōrero to do with Te Rauparaha, prominent leader of the Ngāti Toa people. As far as I understand, he was prophesied that a great taniwha would be produced out of the union of Wera and Parekohatu, his mother. And from that time on, as far as I know, he was taken away and raised as a rangatira. They soon saw that he was very adept at leadership, his prowess in the whare tūtau, his ability, especially in the use of a taiaha. Although short in stature, apparently had a big booming voice.
He was brave, he was courageous, he was a great thinker, he knew about strategy, he knew about structure, he had a great tactical ability. I mean, he was certainly unique.
Alongside is his relation Te Rangi Haiata, who has an equally impressive reputation.
Te Rangi Haiata was always referred to as the nephew of Te Rauparaha, which he was. But when you look at his father was Te Rakaherea. And Te Rakaherea was also a child of Te Maunu. So, in actual fact, from that point of view, Te Rangi Haiata was tuakana to Te Rauparaha.
In any time of absence of Te Rauparaha, Te Rangi Haiata tended to take over. We know this because at the Battle of Taharoa in Kāwhia, Te Rauparaha had got quite sick. And so we know that Te Rangi Haiata took over a lot of that running and organising of that battle. He fought his way with Ngāti Toa through all the battles of his people in Kāwhia, all the way down from Kāwhia, and right up until contact with the colonial government.
He was quite different to his uncle. He was tall and handsome and strong and powerful and clever and all the rest of it, right? But he was also a carver, he was also a poet, he was all these other sorts of things as well. It was him, principally, who refused to enter into sales.
Both rangatira signed Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and both reasonably thought the disputes over land sales at Wairau could and would be settled under the new legal framework.
Well, I think Ngāti Toa were consciously aware of the fact that when they were signing Te Tiriti o Waitangi, they were recognising the importance of Pākehā law. My understanding of how my tūpuna Kahe Te Rauatarangi perceived her signing of the treaty as one of the few women to sign Te Tiriti, along with her cousin Te Rangi Tōpiora, also of Ngāti Toa, was that they were not giving recognition or priority to a Pākehā system of law over and above tikanga Māori. The idea of kāwanatanga and the establishment of Pākehā law was primarily to provide for boundaries and protection of Pākehā citizens.
And the Pākehā law they were willing to trust might have prevailed at Wairau, but for the ambitions of the New Zealand Company.
At the end of 1842, surveyors for the New Zealand Company explore the Wairau district. They come back to Nelson and report that they've found 200,000 acres of extremely good quality agricultural lands, and it seems like the solution to all of the New Zealand Company's problems. There's just one problem with that, which is that the customary owners of those lands have no conception that they've sold those lands, and this is the root of the problem. After the surveyors go back to Nelson and report that this huge area of valuable agricultural lands at Wairau, survey parties descend on the area from about April 1843. Ngāti Toa Rangatira makes several trips to Nelson to appeal to the company not to do this, not to survey their lands. They make it clear that they had never transacted these lands. To the extent that they understood the deed with the New Zealand Company, they understood that it only involved lands at Tasman Bay and perhaps Golden Bay, but certainly not Wairau. And so they're unequivocal about that. And these are brushed off, their concerns are dismissed. A critical factor here is that the New Zealand Company doesn't have legal title to these lands. It doesn't own them, because when the Crown arrives in 1840, one of the very first things it does is to issue a proclamation that says all prior land transactions will be investigated by a Land Claims Commission, and if these are not upheld, the claims to land will be dismissed. The New Zealand Company's claims are subject to this. By early 1843, the process of investigating those claims hasn't been fulfilled. So Ngāti Toa, besides appealing to the New Zealand Company at Nelson, also appealed to William Spain, who's the Land Claims Commissioner responsible for investigating the company's claims. And they ask him, please come south and investigate. And Spain refuses. He says he'll come in time, but he's busy investigating the claims to the Port Nicholson block at Wellington. Well, Te Raupaha was really reliant on Europeans upholding their end of that bargain, and he thought that William Spain, the Land Claims Commissioner, was going to be a key to that Spain would come here, that he would investigate the ownership of the lands, and he would reject the New Zealand Company's claims on these lands. And that's in fact what Spain did too, but the problem was it was 2 years later in 1845. Had Spain come here in June 1843, when Te Raupaha had requested him to do so, this conflict may have been averted.
Te Rangihaeta and Te Raupaha and a large, it's described as a substantial ope, go over to Whakatū and actually turn up to the offices of the New Zealand Company and meet Arthur Wakefield, meet Magistrate Thompson, and actually issue warnings that the Wairau is not available until Spain has made its determination. Now, Arthur Wakefield by then has been schooled on some aspects of tikanga, wants to send away this senior rangatira with a gift. So he brings out a shotgun, beautiful new shotgun, which he gifts to Te Raupaha, who accepts it, goes to give a similar gift to Te Rangihaeta, and he says, no, I will not accept this gift because, quote, by and by you will say with thus, I have purchased the Wairau.
At that time, there were two people who needed to give their consent. One was Te Raupaha and the other was Te Rangihaeta. Te Rangihaeta stood firm. He says, no, he didn't want this, our land to go. And of course, he was right. And yet he was branded a rebel. Yet from a Maori perspective, I would say he should be a Maori hero.
Regardless of negotiations, the New Zealand Company boxes on, driving in survey pegs and building huts. Ngāti Toa responds in kind.
They show incredible restraint. They go to the different camps and they turn up and they pull up the survey pegs, burn down the raupo huts, but then they are absolutely clear that no one is to be harmed and no goods are to be lost. So they carry all of the surveying equipment back to Port Underwood, load them back on the New Zealand Company ship, and then head back to the second encampment and do the same. So they're really, really clear. You are in the wrong place, doing the wrong thing, but we don't want wrong to come to you. Those group turn up back to Whakatū, and the Whakatū newspaper, Magistrate Thompson, immediately have their cause. They have their just war.
The incinerated huts and uplifted survey pegs are cause for settler retaliation. That's how it's framed in Whakatū Nelson by the intemperate local magistrate Henry Thompson.
He needed a reason to arrest Te Rauparaha. And so with this trumped up charge of arson, he had it. He goes around every jurist in Whakatū and has them sign the arrest warrant. And they basically, from then, they are determined to arrest Te Rauparaha and Te Rangi Haiata on the charge of arson.
Back in Whakatū Nelson, righteous indignation takes hold. And who better to teach the natives a lesson than the fiery Henry Thompson?
Henry Thompson was the police magistrate for Nelson, who's one of the few Crown officials in the region. He was also the protector of Aborigines for the area, so ironically one of his explicit tasks was to protect the interests of Māori in that area. Nearly all of those who described him as a very volatile and short-tempered character, and in terms of the delicate world of Māori and Pākehā relationships in the area in the early 1840s, he was possibly one of the worst possible figures to take on such a role.
In June 1843, the leaders round up a posse of 49 Nelson men and head out to arrest Te Rauparaha. It's an exercise in supreme arrogance and ignorance.
Henry Thompson, along with Arthur Wakefield, recruit a body of settlers, and many of them are labourers who have no idea where they're going, what they've been asked to do. They're not actually sworn in as special constables, contrary to what's said sometimes, so they have no legal authority, really. They're not acting on behalf of the Crown in that sense. They take the government brig Victoria, sail around to Cloudy Bay, and early in the morning of the 17th of June, they sail up the Wairau River. They drop their canoes off at the junction of the Tumarina stream and walk up the rest.
As they're getting ready, the second group of surveyors who had been pushed off the land walk in. They disclose they'd been treated fairly and peacefully. And they're saying, if you go now, you're going to inflame things. You're heading literally towards tragedy. Rāwiri Puaha greets them, and he is a passionate evangelist, never goes anywhere without a Bible in his hand, is in the habit of preaching, waving it. And he is absolutely aghast at the foolhardiness of what he sees. And he says, you should not go into the Wairau. And really passionately argued, to the point that apparently Arthur Wakefield was nearly persuaded to turn the ship around. But who speaks up? The magistrate. We have to go and sort them out because we can't allow the natives to set the program.
We're just standing here in front of the titoki tree, which is literally the last witness to the Wairau Affray. What part did it play?
So when the Europeans arrived here, they arrived on this side of the Tumarina stream, and a waka was provided for them to cross over to Ngāti Toa on the other side, and the waka was moored against the tree there. So that's, you know, a living link to that history that took place right here.
It's incredible, really, 190 years.
Yeah.
Camped just across the water are around 120 Ngāti Toa warriors, wahine and children.
If they wanted to go to fight, they would have taken an army. But he took his wives and they took some of their children, we know this, and a few armed soldiers. But other than that, that's the ultimate expression of Māori coming in peace, when you take your wives and your children.
Among the women is Te Rongo, wife of Te Rangi Haiata.
Te Rongo was a woman who was of immense status. She had mana in her own right. As a rangatira, she was a strong, forthright, formidable woman who played a really important role at the time of the migration, the heke, and also in forming subsequent relationships that brought about trade and prosperity for the benefit of her iwi in the 1830s and 40s.
Henry Thompson, though, is determined to arrest Te Rauparaha and Te Rangihaiata on trumped-up charges of setting fire to surveyors' huts. Big mistake.
Te Rauparaha and Te Rangihaiata invite Thompson, invite all of these surveyors, Brooks the translator, over to kōrero. Te Rauparaha does something very unusual when they first cross. He extends his hand. Thompson slaps his hand out of the way. I can only imagine what the Ngāti Toa warriors, the other rangatira, there'd be this collective intake of breath of not only did he not shake hands, he slapped our senior rangatira. He slapped his hand away.
Thompson insists that Te Rauparaha and Te Rangihaiata surrender themselves and make themselves available to be arrested. Te Rauparaha very patiently explains that he is waiting for William Spain, the Land Claims Commissioner, to come and sort all this out. There's been a misunderstanding. The land is his, he'd never sold it. Thompson becomes irate at this and basically says that he's not there to argue, he's there to arrest them.
And at that point, Rawiri Puaha steps in again. And he starts quoting from the Bible about blessed are the peacemakers. He's literally yelling. And Thompson turns in the most horrible voice and tells Rawiri Puaha to be silent. Now, you don't do that to the son of a senior chief. You don't do that to the son of Nohorua, who is there, but he does.
At this point, Te Rangihaiata emerges and he's quite angry about what he's witnessed.
E kore koe mauhere iaia, e kore koe mauhere iau. A kore au e hare ki tō whenua, te mauhere ia Wikitoria. Tino kore rawa. In a Māori cultural context, and especially in the times of my ancestors, it would have been better to be killed and eaten than to be made what we call a here or a prisoner. There was nothing more degrading than to live a subservient life under another person. You would be better off dying.
To a Anglophile, an upright Englishman like Thompson, this is throwing petrol onto every spark. He absolutely erupts in rage at this.
Englishman, forward!
And it's at that point he determines he's going to bring force to bear to cause the arrests to happen. And at some point, someone's shot.
Among the first to fall is Te Rongo, wife of Te Rangihaiata, and her death will not go unavenged.
There are disputing versions of what took place, and what we do know is that gunfire broke out. Te Rongo, the wife of Te Rangihaiata, is killed, along with at least 3 others, possibly as many as 9 Māori killed.
The outcome is never in doubt. Hopelessly inexperienced, outnumbered and outgunned, the settler raiding party is routed and takes to the nearby hills. Some escape, others are killed or caught.
I think if they were applying, say, European rules of warfare as they were understood at the time, they might have assumed that their surrender would mean that they were taken prisoner and eventually freed somehow.
For Ngāti Toa, the consequences of the raid and the fateful shot that killed Te Rongo are steeped in the ancient protocols of Māori. There's no question that utu, revenge, must be fulfilled.
This is the mere pounamu that Te Rangihaeta used to exact utu on the 9 prisoners who had surrendered to Ngāti Toa during their fray. Ko te heke tua, tōna ingoa. And my understanding is that he used this mere himself on each one of those prisoners to avenge the death of Te Rongo and the other Ngāti Toa who were killed that day too. I understand that there has been a lot of debate and controversy over the years, and certainly at the time there was outrage by Pākehā settlers in Nelson and in Wellington at the way in which those prisoners were, in their view, and understandably so, brutally murdered. There is a tikanga Māori context, I think, which is very important to understand. He was acting purely, I think, and instinctively out of respect for upholding the tikanga that he had been instilled with and that he felt he had an obligation to uphold in order to protect and maintain the mana of Ngāti Toa, the mana of Ngāti Mutunga, Te Rongo's people, and the mana of all the iwi who were part of the heke who migrated to the Cook Strait region in the early 1820s. So, you know, I can understand why he took the action that he did.
In the end, for Te Rauparaha and Te Rangihaeta, the skirmish at Wairau was a hollow victory. Immediately after, the colony was in complete shock as survivors straggled back here to Nelson with gruesome accounts of what had happened. 22 Pākehā dead and up to 5 Māori. Terrified, settlers began fortifying the township, and a search party was sent out to recover and bury the dead. And as for Captain Arthur Wakefield, the humiliation doesn't end there.
So Wakefield is the senior chief. He is the head of the New Zealand Company. He's the head of the Whakatū settlement. So under his head, they put a piece of flatbread. Now that's an insult. They don't even accord him the mana of a chiefly rest.
It's an old custom of defiling the mana or the tapu of a chief by placing food in or around the head area. And that was Ngāti Toa making the statement that this is the guy that was responsible. We put the blame on this guy, Wakefield, and his wanting and exigence for acquiring that land in Wairau. And of course, which he paid the price, the ultimate price.
There are some records that record that a pistol was laid across his throat. Now, the two symbols have such meaning. One, you have lost all your mana. We will lay you here, completely bereft of tapu. And we will put a pistol across the throat, your throat that could have spoken up. You're the senior man, you could have used that voice to stop the slaying. And Thompson, of course, when there's some records that say that he had clumps of his own whiskers in his hands, he was so angry and humiliated, he had torn his own whiskers out in frustration before he was killed. The New Zealand Company are determined that they are going to capture the narrative. We innocently went over, we wanted to follow the law, we try to arrest these chiefs, and they start shooting and then kill unarmed prisoners.
Interestingly enough, there are some counter voices, even amongst Europeans. One of the surveyors, John Barnicott, says afterwards that, on balance, he felt that the situation was the one that the Europeans were to blame for, and that Thompson's actions had contributed no end to this outcome as well. That was obvious that his volatile and angry actions on that day, his disregard for tikanga, for protocol, for the murder of these rangatira had contributed enormously to what unfolded.
Immediately afterwards, there are inquiries made by good people. First of all, there is William Swainson. William Swainson is no fan of Ngāti Toa. He is one of the farmers. He's a lawyer, a jurist of some note. He comes to an amazing conclusion. He said the settlers were completely in the wrong, that Thompson was foolish, uses the word foolish, in his assessment.
It's an opinion shared by the incoming Governor Fitzroy, and that infuriates settlers who are demanding nothing less than the arrest and sentencing of the two rangatira.
What unfolds is that when Fitzroy arrives, he meets with Te Rauparaha, another Ngāti Toa, in February 1844. And after listening to their testimony, he declares that the New Zealand Company and the settlers were responsible for what had happened at Wairau in June 1843. He says that the killing of the prisoners was unfortunate, but under the circumstances, their passions were up. They were angry about what had taken place, so he could forgive them for that.
We're standing here at the memorial of some 22 from that posse that perished that day. How significant is this cemetery, this urupa, in terms of our nation, our country?
Well, I mean, this is the site of one of the earliest clashes between Māori and the Crown, or Māori and Pākehā after 1840. So this is really a monument to those Europeans who died, and it reflected that kind of view that what took place here was a massacre, the Wairau massacre. It was referred to for more than a century. Of course, there's no acknowledgement here of the Māori who were killed here, including Te Rango and the others. Estimated between 4 and 9 Māori killed during the exchange.
What they did was protecting their land, and he understood that they were there to protect their land. They didn't cause the issue. The issue was clearly caused by the police commissioner who was in charge at the time. It was clearly his fault.
Interesting thing about Fitzroy is he had served with Arthur Wakefield. He was personal friends with Arthur Wakefield. So he manages to put aside a long-lasting friendship to acknowledge a horrendous loss and yet acknowledges that the settlers were at fault.
Did any of that really matter in the end?
It didn't matter because there was outrage and there was an outcry from the Pākehā settlers in Nelson and in Wellington who demanded retribution and who demanded that Te Rauparaha and Te Rangihata be held responsible. And they demanded that the British government do something about it. So it wasn't long after Fitzroy's report came out vindicating Ngāti Toa that he was removed from office and he was replaced by Governor Grey.
Ngāti Toa lands straddle both sides of Raukawa Moana, Cook Strait. After the events of Wairau in 1843, Te Rauparaha and Te Rangihaiata withdraw to their strongholds here on the Wellington side. Te Rauparaha knew trouble would follow, and it did.
In 1845, Fitzroy is replaced by Governor George Grey. And Grey takes a completely different attitude towards Wairau, and he says Ngāti Toa were to blame for that.
Governor Grey arrived in the Wellington region with very strong military force, with clear instructions from the British government to support and assist the New Zealand Company in acquiring the land that it was claiming through its previous land purchasing arrangements for the benefit of settlers who had either arrived in Aotearoa by that stage on the expectation of receiving their land or who were on their way.
Clearly, he was there to colonise New Zealand, and that was taking the land by any means, lawful or unlawfully, and stripping Māori of their wealth.
By 1846, in the Wellington region, festering land disputes between settlers and Māori erupt into violence. Grey responds with overwhelming force. His troops and their Māori allies march into the Hutt Valley to deal with Te Rangihaiata and local iwi, Ngāti Rangitahi. He also makes his move on Te Rauparaha.
In 1846, you have war breaking out in the Wellington region. Again, Te Rangihaiata is a key player in those events. He evades capture, but Te Rauparaha, who is alleged without foundation really to also be behind what takes place there, is kidnapped, placed on a hulk, eventually sent to Auckland and held under a kind of house arrest with Te Wherowhero.
Why do you say kidnapped and not arrested?
There's no legal process that's applied in the situation. Te Rauparaha is never charged with anything. He's held without trial. The right of habeas corpus that would usually be applied to somebody who was alleged to have committed a crime, where they appear before a court to hear the formal charges against them. They're not applied in this situation.
But the much younger Te Rangihaiata is more elusive, and there's no way he's about to give up mana whenua lands without a fight. From his commanding pā, not far from Porirua, high on the hills of Pāwataha Nui, Te Rangihaiata takes on the British troops for the last time.
The issues in contention in Wellington are very similar. It's about contested New Zealand Company claims to land and mana whenua, saying that we have not sold these lands. And the way that Grey responds to that is that he declares martial law, he sends in the army. The Hutt Valley is the homes of Māori living there, are looted and ransacked. They're forced off those lands at gunpoint. Conflict takes place at Bulcott's Farm in May 1846. In August, Te Rangihaiata is pursued up Battle Hill by a force of British troops and some of their colonial and Māori allies.
Battle Hill, as it will become known, has all the makings of another bloody conflict. Mass troops down below grinding their way forward for attack on attack. Te Rangi Haiata and his warriors hold out for days before melting into the surrounding Horokiwi bush. It's been a carefully marshalled but ultimately doomed campaign, and it marks the last bitter chapter of a conflict that began in Wairau 3 years before.
After Wairau, he would have been on high alert. He would have looked at all their pā, not just in Porirua, but all the way up through, and he would have selected where he could take on the might of the British Empire. So he knew that he could take them on at Horokiri because there were very prominent features in the land that were very hard for the colonial militia to get cannon up, mortar up. They would have had to cut trails in. He had spies in the Pākehā camp, and so he had Rawiri Puaha say that he was going to be a kūpapa and a kāwana man. And so he got 100 rifles out of the kāwana to chase Te Rangi Haiata. But according to our people is that he was actually leaving powder down in the swamps, he was leaving shot, he was leaving guns, they were having hui every night in order to keep Te Rangi Haiata and their people safe.
He evades capture and makes his way to the Manawatu, where he continues really to resist Crown authority for the rest of his life and to be a strong advocate for Ngāti Toa.
In the end, though, Te Rauparaha was imprisoned. Te Rangi Haiata had to live a life of, although relatively free, but in exile up at Parau Tāwhao. And I think the last statement that I understand is that Te Rangi Haiata had said that Ngāti Toa and Te Ātiawa, you fight with words. But you tell Kawana Grey if he wants to have a fight, I'll meet him at Parau Tāwhao. And that's what we call the statement of the Puru Taua. And the Puru Taua is the cork of war. And if he wants to pull the cork, tell him to come up to Parau Tāwhao. But at the end of the day, he didn't pursue Ngāti Toa any further, because I think the objective for him was as long as Te Rangi Haiata was out of Wellington, and he could continue undermining of Ngāti Toa supremacy in order to establish the cities of Wellington, Nelson and Blenheim.
The Wairau really was the beginning of the end for Ngāti Toa. The capture of Te Rauparaha, the exile of Te Rangi Haiata, it left Ngāti Toa devoid of our traditional leadership at a time when we needed it most.
Ngāti Toa lose their senior rangatira, Te Rauparaha. In his absence, Grey pushes through a land deal for Wairau, 600,000 acres of land acquired for £3,000. So that deed is signed in March 1847 by 3 rangatira, including Tamihana Te Rauparaha, all in the absence of his father.
Unfortunately for Māori, George Grey put quite a bit of effort into learning some of the customs of New Zealand. One of the customs that happened was that if you were in a fight, in a battle, and you fell on the battlefield, then the whānau of the fallen chief could claim an interest in that land. So that's what Grey used as a mechanism to try and prize the Wairau out of Ngāti Toa's land. He says, my people have died, and I'm claiming this land. They weren't his people. He wouldn't have known who the hell they were, you know. He might have known Arthur Wakefield, but you know, so what?
Te Rauparaha's iconic haka ka mate resonates to this very day for Ngāti Toa, the challenge and the triumph.
The strategy was absolutely to stay alive. Kamate, kamate, kaora, kaora. You know, it's death, it's life, it's life. It tells us that in those days, that's what it was. It was life and death situations. And the wrong decisions could have a horrible effect on your hapu, your whānau, and your tribe. I think with a new perspective on the Wairau, a new perspective on Battle Hill and Te Rangi Hyatt and Te Rauparaha is absolutely needed, because we've been the product of other people writing about us, and now we have the opportunity to tell our story.
We were told the story of the Wairau, and we were told about this massacre. No one told our story. No one told about the forbearance. No one told about the mana of Te Rauparaha. All we hear about, these poor unarmed settlers were slaughtered. That was the end of a process. And yes, the people of Nelson were brutally harmed. They lost men and lost leaders from this conflict. Ngāti Toa lost so much more.
In this rugged bay of Hongoeka or Plimerton, the deep, deep mawai, the sorrow, it carries in the wind. This whenua is the last toehold of Ngāti Toa. All that's left of lands lost on both sides of the Cook Strait. Defending what was rightfully theirs came at a grievous cost. It would take a full 160 years before the Waitangi Tribunal ruled in their favour. That is, yes, the colonisers breached Te Tiriti in their dealings with Māori. And as for the New Zealand Company pre-1840 land purchases, well, they were ruled invalid. But for Ngāti Toa, it didn't matter. Their lands were gone forever.